We aren't rich, far from it, but we're not quite dirt poor either. For as long as I can remember, my parents and I have lived in a small, fading yellow house tucked deep in the country. It's nothing special, really. The roof's shingles fall off every now and then, and when the rain comes heavy, the ceiling in the living room leaks a murky trickle that smells faintly of rot. Still, the house has always had a certain warmth to it, a sense of safety. Or at least it did. You see, there's something about our house that's different. Unique, at least to me. It started when I was 10, late one restless summer night, when the air hung heavy and sleep wouldn't come. I was supposed to be in bed hours earlier, but my mind buzzed with plans for the next day, too excited to settle. Sitting cross-legged on my bed, I scribbled furiously on a scrap of paper, my flashlight clenched between my teeth. I was in the middle of drawing some elaborate maze when it happened, a sneeze, sharp and sudden. The flashlight tumbled from my mouth, bounced once, and rolled across the floor, finally thudding softly against the wall opposite my bed. I froze, ears straining. Silence. I held my breath, waiting for some sign my parents had heard, but nothing stirred in the house. Just as I let out a relieved sigh, I heard it. Knock, knock. The sound was faint but distinct, coming from the same wall where my flashlight had landed. My stomach twisted, a cold prickling crawling up my neck. I told myself it was nothing, old houses make noise, but then it came again. Knock, knock. I couldn't ignore it this time. Slowly, carefully, I slid out of bed and tiptoed across the room, the wooden floor creaking faintly beneath my weight. My heart pounded as I pressed my ear to the wall. Taking a deep breath, I raised my fist and knocked back, 3 soft taps. A heartbeat passed. Then knock, knock, knock. The reply mimicked my rhythm perfectly. I stumbled back, a mix of terror and thrill bubbling in my chest. Whatever was on the other side wasn't random. It was responding to me. For hours, I stayed there, exchanging knocks with whatever or whoever was behind the wall. Every pattern I tapped out was echoed back, though sometimes the other side added its own quick bursts of knocks, almost frantic, as if it were trying to say something. When the first rays of dawn seeped into my room and I heard my parents stirring, the knocking stopped. I crept back to bed, pretending I'd slept through the night. The next morning, I couldn't stop thinking about the knocks. I knew the wall across from my bed backed into my parents' closet, a cramped, musty space stuffed with old clothes and forgotten junk. Before breakfast, I snuck inside, hoping to find a clue. But it was just as I remembered, heaps of moth-eaten sweaters and crumbling cardboard boxes that reeked of mildew. Nothing unusual. That night, the game resumed. The moment the house fell silent, I crept to the wall and knocked. The response came immediately. The knocking game became a nightly ritual, and each day, I grew more desperate to uncover its source. But every time I tried to investigate, my parents shooed me outside, their usual refrain of, "Go play," brushing off my questions. Finally, one morning at the breakfast table, I couldn't hold it in any longer. "Dad," I said hesitantly, "have you ever heard knocking at night?" He paused mid-chew, his jaw tightening. Slowly, he set down his fork and fixed me with a look that made my skin crawl. "You're supposed to be in bed by 9, he said coldly. "What are you doing up so late?" I mumbled an apology, but I pressed on. "I've been hearing it every night, though. It sounds like it's coming from the wall." For a moment, he just stared at me, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he stood and left the room. That was the last time we spoke about the knocking. But it wasn't the last time I heard it. Not by a long shot. When I asked my father about the noise, he barely glanced up, his response curt and dismissive. "Oh, it's probably just mice," he muttered. "I'll set some traps later." The shrug of his shoulders made it clear he didn't want to discuss it further. I didn't believe him, of course, but I let the subject drop. That night, the knocking didn't return. I tried reaching out to my silent friend, rapping softly against the wall. But there was no reply. Just the kind of silence that creeps into your bones. Weeks passed, then months, eventually years. The knocking game faded from my thoughts, a childhood oddity buried beneath the clutter of growing up, until last Friday night. I'm 15 now, nearly 16. The memory of those knocks had become a distant haze, a strange story to tell myself on sleepless nights. But when I heard it again, knock, 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 the sound jolted me upright in bed. It was the same pattern that had started the game all those years ago. My heart raced as I crossed the room, my knuckles trembling as I tapped back against the wall. The response was immediate, a rapid, frenzied succession of knocks that sent a cold shiver down my spine. I backed away, terror gripping me. My childhood playmate didn't feel playful anymore. It felt wrong. The knocking didn't stop, growing louder and more erratic. I dove under the covers, trying to block out the sound. Eventually, the knocks faded into silence, but sleep didn't come. The next morning, the knocks consumed my every thought. What was it? Why now? I was no longer a curious child, but a teenager desperate for answers. On Saturday, my parents announced they'd be spending the evening in the city, a rare night out for them. The moment the door clicked shut behind them, I made my move. I slipped into their closet, flashlight in hand, and pushed aside the clutter. Despite the hours we'd spent cleaning earlier that day, the space was still a mess of boxes and old clothes. I worked my way to the back wall, heart pounding with every step. I knocked softly, the sound oddly hollow. Frowning, I pressed my ear against the surface and knocked again. The reverberation was strange, almost unnatural. Running my hands along the baseboards, I felt something a gap. Oh, the naked eye. It looked like a small chip in the wood. But as I prodded it, I realized it was more. I hooked my fingers into the gap and pulled. The wall swung outward. The air inside was damp and stale, a foul smell wafting out as I peered into the space. My flashlight flickered across the tiny room, a cramped, hidden cavity no larger than a broom closet. The floor was bare wood, stained and splintered, and in one corner lay a pile of ratty blankets, crusted with filth. A molding cardboard box sat beside them, but it was the chain hanging from the far wall that made my stomach churn. Heavy, rusted, and bolted deep into the wood. My hands trembled as I stepped inside. I didn't want to go in, but something compelled me, pulling me forward against my better judgment. Dropping to my knees, I dragged the cardboard box toward me. Inside was a tattered paperback copy of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, a handful of broken crayons, and a stack of yellowed newspaper clippings. My fingers trembled as I lifted the articles, scanning the headlines. Indiana child snatched from yard. 5-year-old Cassandra Wyatt missing. Search for 7-year-old James yields nothing. Each headline was worse than the last. Beneath the words were photos of children smiling, innocent faces frozen in time. One picture caught my eye, a blonde-haired, blue-eyed girl with a shy smile. The date on the clipping was over a decade old. My stomach twisted as I set the papers aside and picked up the book. Its cover was worn, the spine cracked from years of use. Scrawled inside the front cover in faded pencil was a name, Cassie. The flashlight flickered, and for a moment, I thought I heard something, a faint, rhythmic tapping like someone knocking from deep within the walls. This time I didn't knock back. Opening the battered cover of the book, I froze. Words scrawled on the inside stopped my heart cold. To our darling from Mom and Dad, it began in faded ink. But beneath that, a series of names had been written and violently crossed out. Some of the names matched those from the newspaper articles, the missing girls. My eyes traced the jagged lines that obliterated each name until I found the last one. Jane. It had been crossed out with such force that the paper tore slightly. And just beneath it, written in the same trembling hand, was my own name. My hands shook as I flipped frantically through the book, desperate for answers. About halfway through, My fingers brushed against something wedged between the pages. A bookmark, but not an ordinary one. It was a thin, brittle lock of hair, tied with a strand of red thread. I stared at it in disbelief, bile rising in my throat. The hair looked human. Swallowing hard, I turned to the marked page 128. It was the part of The Wizard of Oz where Dorothy seeks help from the wizard. My eyes scanned the passage, catching on sentences and words circled over and over in a manic frenzy. Send me back. I am only a helpless little girl. And then, the one that made my blood run cold. Help me, and I will help you. I slammed the book shut as the faint sound of tires crunching on gravel reached my ears. My parents were home. Heart pounding, I shoved the book and the papers back into the box and scrambled out of the hidden room, slamming the wall panel shut behind me. I was barely out of their bedroom when the front door creaked open. My father's eyes locked onto me immediately. There was something in his gaze I hadn't noticed before, something dark, almost predatory. My mother followed, her face lit with a bright, unnerving smile. "We have good news," she chirped. "We're adopting another child. How would you like a sister?" Her words hung in the air like a noose tightening around my neck. I couldn't speak. It took every ounce of strength to force a smile and nod. "That's wonderful," I managed to choke out, my voice trembling. That was 2 days ago. Since then, they've been watching me closely. Too closely. Every time I try to leave the house, there's an excuse. Every time I make a move, I feel their eyes on me. At night, I lie awake, staring at the ceiling, listening for the knocks that used to haunt my walls. But the silence is worse. I know now that the house isn't haunted by ghosts. It's haunted by something far more terrifying them. There are no neighbors out here, no one to hear me scream. We're miles from the nearest town with only one car, and they keep the keys. I don't know what to do. My home isn't a sanctuary anymore. It's a trap,